Very much, and it's great to be here and to see lots of people on the meeting. I've been asked to speak for 6 minutes, so I'm going to make sure I keep to time, and all the other fantastic speakers get their part too. And I'm going to focus on, I'll tell you a bit about who the Refugee Council is, and then I'm going to focus on what we know about who's coming across the channel, why they're making those dangerous journeys, and what some of the solutions might be that are actually quite different to how the current UK government is approaching it. So the Refugee Council, we're the largest single provider of services working with people in the UK asylum system and people that come here as refugees through so-called safe routes, resettlement pathways, or through the Ukrainian visa scheme that we have in this country, or for example, the Afghan resettlement scheme. And we provide a range of services to them. We work specifically with children who travel to the UK alone, taking very dangerous journeys. And we've been operational for over 70 years, having been formed after the UK signed the UN Convention on Refugees back in 1951. So the issue of channel crossings is a hot political issue in the UK. Indeed, the new Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, has identified it as one of her top 3 priorities as Home Secretary. She said that to Home Office staff when she took up her post very recently. And it's something which the government, in its words, wants to stop. Essentially, it wants to make the route unviable, as the previous Home Secretary, Priti Patel, pledged to do. And as a consequence of that, it is a highly charged political issue that attracts an awful lot of attention. In fact, during the pandemic, I was told that in number 10 for the Prime Minister and his team at the time, boats and backlogs being in the NHS, but boats being the channel crossings, was the top 2 priorities for the Prime Minister. Believe it or not, it might sound remarkable, but that is the way it's playing out in politics here. And the government would have people believe that everyone that's coming across the channel, or indeed the vast majority of them, are economic migrants, so to speak, and that they're all single males, and therefore they are seeking to play the system, and in their words, shop around playing the asylum system. The reality, of course, is far from the truth. Our analysis, which was referred to in the introduction, and official data very clearly shows that the nationalities that are coming across the channel from places such as Syria, Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, Eritrea are countries where people have good reason to flee and seek protection under the UN Convention because of the circumstances in those countries. And when you look at decision-making and what's known as the grant rate at first decision in this country, it's very clear that the vast majority of those people are coming here and found to be refugees with a well-founded fear of persecution. The grant rate for some of those nationalities is well over 80%, and for some over 90%. So there's a real issue with the government claiming they're economic migrants, because their own data just doesn't support that fact. The reason why they're coming, I think, is complex, and it's become more complex now because recently there's been an upsurge in Albanians coming across the channel, which has caused a lot of media attention. It's worth noting that more than half of Albanians, 53%, are granted protection at initial hearing. That obviously means that there are a significant number that aren't, and there's no doubt that the economic issue is playing a part there, but it's difficult to understand why there's been an upsurge in Albanians. I think one of the key reasons people take these dangerous journeys is because they have no option. I mean, we all know that. Anyone that works on this issue, or anyone that's gone through the experience personally, knows that. You can't just walk into the British Embassy in Kabul, for example, and say, I'm fleeing for my life from the Taliban. give me a passport and a visa. So give me a visa rather, so I can get with my passport directly to safety in the UK, because I want to be in the UK to be with my family, or I have community connections there. You can't do that if you're in Syria. You can't do that if you're facing the conflict in Eritrea. It's just not an option. There aren't legitimate safe routes for people. There are very limited safe routes. And if you're seeking to join a family member, the options for family reunion are highly restrictive too. So it's not surprising people take dangerous journeys. Having said that, it's always been the case. If you look at the flow of people to the UK seeking asylum, there have always been people who have made so-called irregular journeys because of their choosing. They've wanted to do that. As I say, they don't have an option. But even if they were, and we're not naive about this at the Refugee Council, even if there were far more safe routes, there would still be some that take dangerous journeys. So what matters there is upholding the principle in the convention that you grant people a fair hearing when they get to the UK, that you abide by the principle in the convention that people have the right to determine where they seek asylum, and that the UK government also abides by an important principle underwritten in the convention, that the UK shares responsibility with other nations for the fact that there are people making dangerous journeys and through no fault of their own are seeking safety. And those, unfortunately, are principles which the government in the UK is challenging. It's seeking to criminalize people for taking what it calls illegal journeys. It's seeking to label them, and arguably quite successfully so with their narrative and with the media discourse, as illegal immigrants, not as individuals who are seeking safety, who are legitimately seeking asylum. And it's seeking to use very harsh measures to push them back. And of course, there's the Rwanda policy, the Rwanda deal, where it's seeking to transport people around the globe to Rwanda, to outsource them to be dealt with by the Rwandan system, and to effectively wash their hands of them. Quite a watershed moment, I would say, not only in terms of UK asylum policy, but in terms of global asylum policy, and a real challenge to the UN Convention in terms of the message it sends to other nations that the UK is prepared to do this. Of course, there are alternative solutions, as well as upholding the principle, I say, of giving people a fair hearing, seeking to expand safe routes, whether that's through family reunion, whether that's through a much more ambitious resettlement program, whether that's through creating the option to apply for humanitarian visas at UK consulates, or so-called hotspots, facilities that could be provided in different parts of the globe. But also critically, the UK government needs to stop having a war of words with the French and have a grown-up conversation with the French and the EU. Now we're no longer part of the EU, that becomes, of course, much more challenging. But there's no indication that the British government is willing to do that. And there's no indication that it's prepared to take a multilateral approach, because, of course, as I'm no doubt will hear, this is a challenge not just facing the UK, but a challenge globally, a challenge facing the whole of Europe. And the parallel I make is like climate change. Unless you address this from a multilateral perspective, you won't begin to deal with what is a complex issue with an appropriate policy response. And with France, that does require looking at cooperation. It does require about working with the French when people arrive in northern France and treating them humanely and respectfully, and ensuring that there's a mechanism for them to have safe passage to the UK. I think I'll leave it there so others can contribute. I'm sure that people will have questions, and I'll be very happy to take questions once the other speakers have made their contributions. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Enver, for raising so many key issues in such a short period of time. I think we'll go straight to Liz and Justin's talk now.
Thanks. I'm going to share my screen, and thank you, Enver. It will be a challenge, of course, to follow up on that. Okay, I have some slides here, and before I begin, I did want to thank Lena and Hannah, but also acknowledge that Justin and I have been working on this project together. In the interest of time, we decided that one of us would do the speaking and the other would field more of the questions. And so, but please do know that though you're hearing from me, this is not just a collaborative research with Justin, but also with our Sicilian collaborators and the local communities with which we work. Our topic for today, we come here, Justin and I come here as archaeologists rather than policymakers, first humanitarian respondents, or news correspondents. And the question that we're hoping we can answer in this discussion or contribute to is how archaeology and how the academic discipline of archaeology can help to inform a humanitarian response. For us, it's an emphasis on the objects of everyday life that are found through archaeology that can help us see the human faces of movement, the conditions of movement, the experiences of the spaces, some of the topics that Enver just brought up in terms of the compelling need to take these dangerous journeys on particular boats with particular objects. We focus on the long-term trajectory of interactions that can help us see the entanglement of ancient and modern, that can help us think through this idea of contemporary crisis versus ongoing systems of both mobilities and immobilities. And we also draw on the storytelling power of archaeology, which is something that certainly in Italy, we work in Sicily, and throughout the Mediterranean, archaeology as the study of the past, the creation of heritage, can help us meet people where they are and use this idea of heritage to think through not just the ancient past, but the material markers of journeys and migrations from antiquity through the present day. So as we do this, we've been working in Sicily for the past 10 years or so. Initially with our work began as a study of the maritime landscape of Southeast Sicily, and we began with the excavation of a late Roman shipwreck, a church wreck in Sicily, carrying the marble cargo of a church. Our interest was in the big scale economic questions, but also the smaller scale questions of the people who crossed the sea, the many voices, the sailors, the travelers, as well as the stonecutters and the traders and the wealthy purchasers of this massive quantity of 100 tons of marble. But over the course of our work in Sicily, we were struck by the presence along the landscape, not just of ancient ships, but of contemporary boats impounded in the harbors around of Southeast Sicily. And we were struck by a need as archaeologists to record this heritage, to take notice of this heritage, both its presence along the shores, but also its destruction, its cleaning, its burning, the moving of these boats, and the way they were received by the community. These are boats that were either impounded or abandoned on the shores that brought migrants normally from North Africa to the shores of Sicily. The question of archaeology being mobilized for activist causes and questions of bringing attention to the idea of migration and movement is something that Jason de Leon has spearheaded in the Sonoran Desert, where he's really used the objects left by migrants in the desert to call attention to U.S. border policies, prevention through deterrence, and this bringing of people through new and deadly routes across dangerous terrain, and also the systematic erasure by placing it in the desert of the stories of these people making crossings. So as archaeologists, we had the opportunity beginning in 2018 to begin looking closely at some of the boats that brought migrants across the central Mediterranean. We recorded in 2019 a boat that had arrived in November of 2018 from Libya to Sicily with 264 people on board, a fishing boat normally designed for about 6. The boat was intercepted by the Sicilian authorities and impounded as a customs violation. And we began recording this as an archaeological artifact with an eye toward looking at the material left behind. We saw the transformations from a traditional fishing boat to a people carrier, the straps that people held on to, the communities of people, the cement added to the bottom of the boat to provide for extra ballast at the bottom for this new cargo of people, the ephemeral objects left behind that give us a sense of men, of women, of children on board, of the organization, or in this case, the lack of individual organization of journeys, the medicines on board for the protection of the people, the blankets, the coverings, the clothing, and the food provided, in this case, what we think by the organizers of this journey rather than separate communities who would have organized their own crossings, as we see more often in journeys from Turkey to Greece. We found archaeologically evidence for phone numbers reflecting a huge range of countries, for languages, for translations, and the communities that were developed on this boat, as well as the erasure, the discarding of documents, of Bibles and Qurans that were part of people's individual heritage, as well as the individuality of the boat, all erased in the quest for a burning of papers, a burning of lives in order to find something new, avoid authorities and border regimes by destroying documents to create a new life. What we see moving forward is that there are many stories, not just the stories of the inflatable boats, not just the stories of fishing boats, but new routes such as a boat we looked at this past summer, the Calabrian route from Turkey to Italy, avoiding the border controls of Greece. And here we see some of the evidence for more expensive trips that are made from Italy to Calabria, and in our case, got washed away by a storm and taken to Sicily. We see the use of sailboats and that are designed to sail below the radar and avoid detection by the authorities. And we look at all of these different evidences for the boats and the people who made these crossings as a means to engage local communities in this idea of a long-term maritime heritage that spans from the trade of ancient marble to the movements of peoples today, using those known connections to migration that we see in archaeology, in literature, in drama, the idea of the sea as the source of connections, and allowing us to tell these stories of mobility with humanitarian goals that let us join together antiquity, historic voyages, and the present day, allowing communities to say, yes, this is not simply a momentary crisis, but part and parcel of the heritage that has created the Sicily that we inhabit. And in doing that, we're hoping that we can include these new boats in a much longer tradition of a humanitarian heritage of journeys, mobilities, and immobilities. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Liz. And I know, Justin, you're also very much part of these projects. And I'm glad that towards the end you raised that question of crisis and the problematics around that. And I hope maybe we can discuss that with the panel later about whether that helps or hinders some of their abilities to move forward. And now next, if we move to Matea from Sea-Watch.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening, everyone. I will ask Hannah, I think, to share my screen because my computer is just not doing the way I wanted, or it's not behaving the way I wanted it to behave. Thank you first and foremost for the invitation, and I'm looking forward to all the other distributions. So basically, as we have two people from search and rescue NGOs here in this panel today, I wanted to focus a little bit more on something else. I wanted to focus not necessarily on the boats. I think this is the last slide. So if you just move up to the first one. Yeah, I'm just gonna say a little bit this whole moving thing at some point. So I'm sorry for that. So basically, I'm gonna focus a little bit on our monitoring operations that we have within Sea-Watch. And before I start, I also would like to mention a little bit that I would like to use this as kind of a little bit of a manifest that we need to work more together as researchers, as journalists, and as NGOs, for example, like Sea-Watch. And I think that we will talk later maybe also about really, really good examples how this has worked out. And I think the question that is posed in the panel, in my understanding, needs to be a little bit changed, because I think we need to look more into how can we actually combine our forces and basically shed light on what's going on. But I will basically talk about that in a little bit. Because I do think it's quite important to note that we have quite a lot of research, for example, on search and rescue in the Central Mediterranean Sea. We have research on the structure of NGOs. We have research on boat arrivals, on how many people are actually migrating to Europe, for example, on all of these numbers. We also have a lot of research on the so-called pull factor, where basically researchers or journalists look into the fact of why are people crossing and what happens to them once they arrive, how many are arriving, where are they from, all of these questions that might actually lead to a very different response than what I will talk about. Because a lot of times this data, these questions and these research is being used to show again the big impact that migration potentially has on the European continent and how many people are actually migrating to Europe. But what we don't look at is this, what I'm like to call the big black box of the Central Mediterranean. And I know, and that's why I'm especially really happy to see also journalists here in the attendee list, probably I would say, or a few people that I know at least, and also of course Daniel, that you're here. But I do think there is some work that is being done on the Central Mediterranean Sea that is looking really closely and investigating of what's happening, but this is just way too little, and there is actually the need for much more of that. And I will at the end close a little bit with what I would say are things that we really need to closely observe in the future, and would be basically something that I would like to share with all of you, that I think there is things we need to look at. Because, and this is where I will start with a little presentation, and then you can move one slide forward, thank you. Because there actually is data in the Central Mediterranean Sea, and there is, of course, some sort of black box, but I think if we would join our forces together, if we would combine research, investigative journalism, and actually NGO efforts together, we would be able to solve quite a few things. And I think a lot of people know Sea-Watch, or also SOS Méditerranée, of course, who's also here, more in the sense of that we are a search and rescue organization that operates with ships and that conducts rescue, which is 100% correct. But we also conduct air reconnaissance, air flights with 2 airplanes. On the left side, you see Moonbird, who is not really, unfortunately, flying at the moment. And on the right side, you see our aircraft Seabird. And I'm going to share with you a little bit of the data that we collected in 2021. I chose 2021 because we have a full year, so it's a bit more comprehensible than looking at data of 2022. And I think it's really important that we look at it precisely and that we actually think about it, how we can make use of that in research and journalism. So to give you a couple of brief numbers, with the airplanes, we flew 121 monitoring flights with a total flight time of 214 hours and 45 minutes. And we spotted 190 boats with over 11,000 people in distress. This is something that we collect and we try to observe, and we try to gather the information in order to make sure that we understand each and every case. Of course, this is not only Sea-Watch that is doing this, but this is basically also with the help of journalists, with the help of the Alarm Phone, for example, and with the help of other actors that are monitoring the Central Mediterranean Sea. And now you can click the next slide. And this is basically what we've witnessed. So in red, you see the boats where we can make sure, or we are actually quite sure that they are being pulled back, or that they were pulled back by the so-called Libyan Coast Guard back to Libya. So what we were able to find out in 2021 with the help of our ground crew, with the help of the air crew, with the help of the networks, journalists, research, etc., is that we can actually look at precise numbers. But, and that's basically the most important thing, is that we have on the bottom right a number of 53 boats with over 2,300 people where we don't know what happened. So they're not popping up in any statistics. They're not popping up in the arrival statistics. They're not popping up in the people who are drowned statistics. They're basically completely lost. They're gone. We don't know what happened with these boats, and we're unaware of basically their the remainings. What we also see is that the NGO vessels, they're actually not the ones that have the highest number in rescued people, for example. A lot of boats make it on their own. A lot of boats are being pulled back. And I think these are numbers where we confuse a little bit the research focus on just NGOs and just basically the pull factor, or the so-called pull factor. Why are so many people coming to Europe, etc.? Because we're kind of forgetting also the other numbers around. And I know that there's remarkable pieces that have been done on these kind of things, but I think we're still in a lot of ways seeing how the focus is a little bit mismatched to what we're actually seeing in the Central Med. So this is just something that you can look at if you want to read the full report. And before we continue, you can download it on the website, or you can just Google the Airborne Annual Report 2021, where we actually explain these numbers. You can go one slide further. Thank you. So it's a little bit small, but this is just to give you also a little bit of an idea. On the left side, you basically see all the boats that we have spotted with our airborne operations. And different colors are actually marking different events. So this could be, for example, a rescue by Italian authorities, a rescue by NGOs. This could be a shipwreck. This could be also a pullback by the so-called Libyan Coast Guard. On the right side, you see empty boats that were spotted. And this is basically then tried to be matched with different cases. So if we look at an empty boat, we try to match them if they actually are matching a NGO rescue, if they are matching, for example, an interception by the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, or if they might have been rescued by European authorities, which is of course very rarely. But, and I want to just put your attention to the last sentence, the outcome of 138 empty boats remains unknown. So again, 138 empty boats were unable to match. We don't know if they belong to a pullback, if they belong to something else. All right, next up. And so I'm really excited about the further panel, because I think what is one of the most important thing, and this is just one example, is how we are actually able to witness a cooperation between Frontex and the either the European Border Agency, sorry, the European Border Forces, but also the so-called Libyan Coast Guard. And here you have a couple of boats that we were actually able to identify, and we were actually able to vaguely reconstruct the involvement of Frontex in these different cases. And most of them, as you're maybe not surprised, I don't know how many people are in the topic in detail, are again then combined with an interception of the so-called Libyan Coast Guard. So what we were able to record in the past year and also this year is that Frontex is involved in coordinating illegal pullbacks with the so-called Libyan Coast Guard. And there's, again, really, really nice pieces about this, but I think this is something that we would actually be able to really, really look closer and in depth into if we combine the forces of investigative journalists, researchers, NGO activists, etc. This is just one example, just basically a teaser. If you look in the annual report, you can actually find an explanation of each of these boats. So what we try to do is reconstruct basically the whole case and make sure that everybody understands what happened in these specific cases. I think the next one is the ending slide. So this is just an image of a vessel of the so-called Libyan Coast Guard in the middle of an illegal pullback of migrants to Libya, or of people on the move to Libya. And what I'm trying to close with, because I kind of lost time, but I think I'm probably already over 4 minutes, is that I think there's a few things that we would need to observe and that we need to shift the focus on. Because I do think that the focus shouldn't necessarily always be on the number of arrivals in order to really understand what's going on, but we need to look into the black box, because there is data we can use. There is actors that are involved in collecting this data, for example. And I think for the future, there is 4 actors we really need to look deeply into. Of course, it's Frontex. A lot of people are doing this, but we need to also shift the focus a lot more to the Central Mediterranean Sea. There is the so-called Libyan Coast Guard, especially in combination with Frontex. There is Malta, because in the Maltese Search and Rescue Zone, we basically know zero what's happening, because they're operating so much under the radar. And last but not least, for our German fellows, there is the Greenes in Germany, for example. Or other member states, you can also use them as just one example, that are actively supporting these other actors. And I think if we look closer into these 4 different parts, we will actually be able to understand much better what's going on in the Central Mediterranean Sea. And I hope that we can, combine the forces to do so in the future. And I'm going to end with this, and I'm sorry if it was longer than 6 minutes.
Thank you so much for that, Matej, and also for raising all those issues at the end of collaborations. That's really important. And thank you, Tim, for putting all those links into the chat as Matej was talking. They're really helpful as well. And we'll go straight on to Julia. Thank you.
Thank you, Elena, and thanks a lot to all the speakers for this really interesting discussion. So as mentioned at the very start, my name is Julia Black. I work for the International Organization for Migration on the Missing Migrants Project, which documents deaths and disappearances worldwide. And while this project did start out kind of as a response to maritime migration deaths, I actually am going to take this opportunity to take a bit of a step back from maritime migration specifically to talk about one of the consequences of boat crossings, which is the issue of missing migrants more generally. So I'll very briefly just touch on what we're doing on the missing migrants. Then I really want to take the chance to reflect on this question that's kind of cutting across this whole panel, which is how can data inform policy? So the Missing Migrants Project at its core started out as and continues to be a data collection project. So we document deaths and disappearances of people on the move across the world. Because there are very, very few official sources of that, we rely on quite a few different information sources, including several of those represented by the speakers here today. We also conducted with Sam Occhiere and several other researchers more qualitative research on the impacts of these disappearances on families. This was conducted in 4 countries across Africa and Europe, because these families are in countries of origin, yes, but also in countries of transit and destination, including the United Kingdom. That's the area of work that we receive funding for. What we don't receive funding for, but we do anyways, is advocacy, both externally but also internally within the UN system. So of course, this involves informing policymakers, humanitarian actors, and the public about our data, about our research findings. But also we work a lot with, our state, the organizations we work with, to create recommendations to address the issue linked to deaths and disappearances during migration. And I'm actually going to borrow a bit from the ICRC, who's the other kind of major international humanitarian actor on this topic. to frame this around 3 areas: prevention, so preventing deaths, which ultimately is providing safe legal pathways, but is also things like state-led search and rescue, or at least not criminalizing non-governmental or commercial actors who conduct rescue of migrants. It's case resolution, so after a death occurs, what happens to that body? Is it ever identified? And families, so who are these families? What do they need? Unfortunately, these are, as I kind of go down this list, these issues become, less and less addressed. And I will just add the caveat here that our recommendations are really explicitly aimed at states, because they have the legal obligations to address these issues defined by international human rights law and humanitarian law, often also in national law, but also, to be quite frank, because states are the ones that have huge capacities. They're the ones who can conduct search and rescue in the tens of thousands, where NGOs unfortunately have had to fill in this gap. So yes, so briefly that's what we do on the Missing Migrants Project. And I want to take a moment to speak to my experience about how data can inform policy. I have worked now on this topic for 7 years. We have documented more than 50,000 deaths during migration. We are hearing from all these speakers that there are really concrete research findings that humanize this issue, but also point to areas where action could be taken to prevent deaths, to resolve cases, to help families. And yet, in the 7 years that I have worked on this topic, very little concretely has been done by states. So the one kind of major international step forward is the signing of the Global Compact on Migration, which some of you will know includes an objective 8 on saving lives and establishing coordinated efforts on missing migrants. The reality of the situation is that document is non-binding. There was a voluntary review conducted earlier this year, and Objective 8 received the fewest responses of any objective in the compact. And having gone through all of those, not one of them was substantively preventing deaths, resolving cases, or addressing the needs of families. So I will say from the Missing Migrants Project, a few areas where we are seeing the start of progress. And I want to kind of link this to research work that I think, at least in part, has spurred some progress led by states. So there are 3 examples of this, the first of which is in Mexico. INEGI, the Statistical Office of Mexico, following a series of kind of discussions we had with them, is now creating a methodology to retroactively and also moving forward identify mortality records that are linked to migration. So this is, to my knowledge, the first country that will ever really proactively document deaths during migration and also report them. They will be reporting them to us because we're also used as an SDG indicator. The second example of this is in Ethiopia. So I mentioned earlier, we did this qualitative research project in the UK, Spain, Ethiopia, and Zimbabwe on families of missing migrants. And in Ethiopia, after, unfortunately, the rather grim findings, which said families have no way of reporting. When they do report, they're often treated really poorly by the authorities. The Ethiopian government engaged with us on this issue and added a question to their census, asking every household, do you know if a person from your family has gone missing in the context of migration? And they identified more than 51,000 people just from Ethiopia who are missing in the context of migration. Missing, we don't know if they're dead, if they're somewhere and have lost contact, in detention, or for any other reason. Considering that we've documented 50,000 deaths in total across the world on the Missing Migrants Project, this is a huge concern. The other area, or the last example I wanted to give is on, we did this family project also in Zimbabwe. ICRC did an assessment with families also in Zimbabwe around the same time, and together this, again, really similar findings across every country we conducted research. This did lead to Zimbabwe and South Africa, where most of these missing migrants probably are, to take a few really concrete steps to address this issue. There is now a Zimbabwe South African high-level government working group aiming towards a bilateral agreement, which is needed for kind of like this case resolution issue of identifying remains or a missing person. ICRC is leading trainings on forensics in South Africa because there are tens of thousands of unidentified bodies, many of which are likely migrants. And we are also training the Zimbabwean police on collecting reports from families of missing migrants in a way that is respectful, in a way that is sensitive, that in a way that at least begins to address their needs. I will say it's notable that the two countries where we conducted research which did see action were in Africa. The two countries where we conducted research in Europe, Spain and the UK, the government was not, we were not able to engage with the governments on this issue. So keeping in mind the time, I just kind of had to leave some open questions for myself for the discussion, which is exactly the heart of this discussion. When is research effective at creating a meaningful response? Is a global project like the Missing Migrants Project effective when we aren't seeing, meaningful policy responses to prevent deaths? From these three examples, I kind of take away that, when research builds on existing or coincides with existing socio-political movements to create action, like in Mexico, where we have families, mothers of missing migrants protesting in the street about the disappearance of their sons, their brothers, and so on. I also think it can, quite cynically, happen when research is used to leverage funding for interventions, as we're seeing now in Zimbabwe. And IOM funded the addition of this question to the Zimbabwean survey. So this is also one way forward that research can really inform humanitarian funding on this issue. I also wanted to ask the question, who are the right actors to conduct the research on this? I asked this because of criticism that on our project, we hear that before the missing migrants came about, there were many NGOs doing really excellent work to document deaths, and now we have this global project that has a greater reach. And so in some way we have co-opted the visibility of this really valuable work of civil society and NGOs on this topic, as well, because we are an IGO with member states, that there are specific things we can and can't say in this way. Yes, so at the same time, though, the UN does have maybe more connections to large pots of funding, more, sort of soft power in terms of connections to policymakers, that can be good and bad for us to be conducting this types of research. Yes, just a final thought, I think it's also important beyond just who conducts the research, it's also important to reflect on who is here with us today. I'm really pleased that the organizers were able to find, to put together a panel of NGOs, IGOs, academics, journalists, but I think it's quite noticeable that the voice of policymakers are absent, but also that the voices of migrants and their families are also not represented in this discussion. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Julia, and particularly for that reflective critique throughout and at the end. That is very well taken. It's not that they were not invited, so just to let you know that. And now we move to Daniel and to Sophie. And just to reassure you, in the room itself, there are many people definitely from that latter category.
Hi, everyone. It's good to be taking part here. And I'll thank the previous participants in the round table. In particular, I'm going to build on some of the observations that Mattea made with her comments and make some suggestions for collaboration. a little bit about Lighthouse itself. So we're a non-profit investigative newsroom. We're based all over Europe. I happen to be speaking to you from my base, which is Athens in Greece. But we have people working with us from across Europe. And borders is a big focus of our work. I will briefly just drop into the chat a link to a summary of our borders work and investigations. There's a bit of possible further reading. The first thing to say about Lighthouse, or the unusual thing about Lighthouse, is that we're not ourselves a platform. So you don't, apologies, it's rather dark where I am. The lights aren't working brilliantly in the office, so because we've got a black slide, I've just gone into shadow. So Lighthouse basically reaches the public with its investigations by partnering with existing media. What we are is a collective of journalists with very specific skill sets, and by which I mean data scientists, open source investigators, experts in freedom of information, and then domain experts, people who have been covering these issues in different ways for a number of years, and therefore are looking beyond the spectacle of what's happening and what's driving the news agenda right now. So with a capacity to think about where the opportunities are to explain how the systems work and what works. This is probably one of the briefest presentations ever because it's got one slide, which is the results. So we'll come to the results of this in a moment, but I want to talk a little bit about the background to this. So we've heard a couple of things stated about what role research can play. And I think it's, what I'd like to talk about is a kind of, it's going to take us a little bit through the mirror darkly. I'm going to talk to you about an incredibly crystal clear instance of how data can be used to willfully misinform policy. It'll be the second mention of Frontex today. Frontex, the European Coastal and Border Agency, was for a long time a relatively underfunded organization that was essentially there to coordinate actions between different EU member states, border and coastal Coast Guard agencies. In recent years, it's played an incredibly clever empire building game and has built up an enormous budget, is trying to make the transition into being an operational agency. And one of the things that it does very well is to play on European governments' anxieties about migration and present itself as a kind of technocratic solution to these anxieties. So Frontex generates enormous amounts of data. Now, we've been reporting on Frontex and its role in the Aegean, in the Central Mediterranean for some time. We've partnered regularly with Le Monde, with Spiegel, with The Guardian, with various different television stations around Europe, and have had some success in connecting Frontex's actions. So the surveillance that it does, the equipment that it has deployed in places like the Aegean and the Central Mediterranean, with the actions of the kind like the illegal pullbacks that Sea-Watch observe or illegal pushbacks in the Aegean. Now, some of these stories and some of the evidence that we've gathered and some of the ways that we've been able to persuade major media to run high-profile stories on this has helped to create a series of investigations into how Frontex is working and what it's doing. And I think this goes really to the core of a lot of what's been said today, which is, what do we do in a situation, and this is very relevant to boat crossings, what do we do in a situation when we're trying to understand exactly how far state actors and European agencies are prepared to go in telling lies to the public, in giving data that they know to be incorrect or untrue or misrepresentative to states in order to connive in policies and pretend that there's an evidence base for policies when it doesn't exist. So if we could move to the second slide, I think we're ready to get to the end of this. So having spent just about 2 years doing different investigations, which showed up corruption in procurement, willfully misleading the European Commission and the European Parliament over its role in pushbacks, a story that we did led within about 24 hours to the resignation of the leadership of Frontex. So you see the headlines that led to that. Some of the key partners are present in these headlines. The actual instance for the resignation of Leggeri and his and the leadership around him was was a combination of exactly the kind of research which I think groups like the one that we have, the interdisciplinary groups like the one that we have present here today, can do. In this instance, freedom of information laws were used to get access to years worth of entries into JORA database, which is where Frontex stores the data that it uses to then give bulletins which justify its budgets and basically excuse what it's doing with the surveillance equipment that's paid for by European taxpayers. They made a huge effort to obscure any usable or useful information inside the data that they gave to us. Despite our right to do this under freedom of information laws, they routinely take the data that we were requesting, print it out in PDF form, and do their absolute best to make it non-machine readable and to make any kind of data work on that very difficult. But put that to one side. We get those, we clean it up, we make it machine readable. We can look into that data. They made a critical mistake with the scrubbing of all incident details from this JORA database, which is supposed to record how Frontex assets encountered people in the Aegean, for instance, and what actions were taken, what follow-ups, how these incidents were categorized. Because they made a mistake in 145 different fields over the space of 4 years worth of data, we were basically able to take what we knew from open sources, so from instances where there was video or there was other evidence that was available in the public domain from different sources or from our own reporters, and basically compare the two data sets. Compare a data set of incidents which we knew where asylum seekers had arrived by boat and were trying to exercise their lawful right to claim protection and to have their cases individually considered, having in some cases made landfall on the Greek islands or in other cases being in Greek waters, and were denied those rights, were taken off of those boats, put into life rafts with no engines and cast adrift at sea, in some cases pushed back into Turkish waters or dumped onto uninhabited islets and left to their own fate. We were able to establish that there was essentially a euphemism used, a piece of bureaucratic language that was meant to obscure what pushbacks were. They're called preventions of departure. A lot of these agencies, and a lot of the time governments as well, are trying to pretend that they are performing lawful actions when they're quite clearly breaking the law. So the prevention of departure, the trick here is that you pretend that these boats were intercepted just as they left Turkish waters and entered into Greek waters, and therefore they were prevented from departing into it. It wasn't that they were prevented from claiming asylum or seeking international protection. We were able to identify that in nearly 1,000 individual cases, relating to 222 separate different incidents, that these preventions of departure were beyond reasonable doubt actual pushback incidences. So we found the pushback fingerprint inside Frontex's own database. And the fallout of this was significant enough that the leadership of Frontex, which had been pretty much fireproof until that stage, decided within a day to resign. Obviously, in giving the grounds for their resignation, they didn't cite this specific incident, but I mean, it happened within a day. So it's pretty clear what the lesson was here. there are an enormous number of possibilities where the datification of migration policies and the interaction of different national and supranational agencies and actors with their huge budgets who are participating in potentially illegal operations gives researchers a huge amount of information that they can work with partners on in order to actually capture wrongdoing or to inform potential strategic litigation. This stuff can be relevant to the actions of NGOs, both in search and rescue, but also the ones who are doing advocacy. It can be incredibly relevant to international law scholars. It can inform strategic litigation, and it can lead to front page news in its time as well. In this instance, I would say that a huge part of what was most effective about these stories is the places in which they were told. It was enormously damaging for the French nationals who were leading Frontex at the time that this story was told. Yes, it was told in leading media in Germany and in Greece and in the UK, but it was also in Le Monde, and the fact that it was there in the French media as well. So getting this kind of getting an authentically kind of continental reach for these stories and these investigations where can really only be achieved by getting big media from individual countries, the champions of those national markets, to engage with these stories. And I know a lot of people feel that this kind of media is fatigued and reluctant maybe to cover these stories, but there are ways to engage them. I would agree with one of my previous panelists in saying that the Central Mediterranean needs more attention. Journalists can sometimes feel that they've done that story as though there's one story to tell there, or there's one approach into a potential investigation. And I think it's incredibly valuable. One of the drawbacks for someone like me who's been reporting on this since the first Central Mediterranean story I did was now 6 years ago. It can be the sense that, okay, yes, but these are things that I know, but they're stories that need to be told again and again, and the new coalitions need to be built. There will be new journalists, there will be new activists, there will be new actors across the board who are getting involved in this. So I think that there is a repeatable map. I put in an explainer on the investigation that we did that I've talked most about in this session, that's into the chat, so people can read about how the evidence was gathered, how we cleaned the data, how we drew the conclusions, how we supported that, etc. But I'd be very happy to talk more about that in the questions.
Thank you so much, Daniel, for raising all those issues and making those connections. And now we're going to move without further ado. Thank you, Sophie, for being so patient. We look forward to hearing your contribution.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Very happy to be here with you. I'm speaking from Marseille in France. I'm very happy to share the discussion with such a brilliant panel of researchers and activists and journalists, etc. Because we need, at my level at least, which is engaged in the daily action of rescue at sea, we need to take a little bit of distance and stop sometimes to think of the main core issues. So I've been working since 2016 as CEO of SSOS Mediterranean chapter in France, and therefore all what I've elaborated is linked with the Central Mediterranean. I'm going to try not to repeat things that have already been said, but I would like to maybe focus on the few minutes I have on how can research inform our humanitarian response in the Central Mediterranean, more specifically. Just maybe before I start to raise these questions, how we can inform our humanitarian response, I would like to start with an anecdote. Speaking of a day in January 2018, when the Aquarius was the only ship patrolling in the Central Mediterranean. And we were receiving, at the time, distress calls were transmitted by Italian Coast Guards, who were still in charge of the coordination for search and rescue in the Mediterranean. So we were patrolling in this area of the Libyan shores, and we received in one day 7 distress cases transmitted on the Aquarius Bridge by the Italian Coast Guards in one day. The search was very difficult. It was winter. We patrolled the area unsuccessfully, and it took us a lot of time to find the first boat. And we rescued these people and resumed the search. But unfortunately, we never found the other boats that were signaled, and we never got a hint of what happened to them. I went to Rome to meet the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center sometime after, but they never gave us an answer on what happened to these 6 other boats that were signaled this day, and we never knew what happened. I tried to alert some journalists, but I really had no time to follow up, and I gave up on that case. And to my knowledge, it has never been, we have never put light on what happened to these people. So that's crossing what has been said before, but we are talking still today of many, many boats that are disappearing. And it was very well said by Sea-Watch, by Mattea, so I'm not going to repeat it. But this is the main concern we have. So for me, the first, and it's really an abyssal question. The first question is about numbers. What is the extent of the tragedy at sea? We don't know. We have estimates, we have reports of what we see and what we know, but many, many boats still disappear without us knowing what happens to these people. How many people die in the shipwrecks? How many people disappear? We don't know. We don't know what are the circumstances of their deaths, and we don't know how it could have been avoided. And this is for me a very painful question because we have started 7 years ago, 6 years ago. NGOs have been patrolling the area, but still the black hole is here. Maybe less because the presence of civilian ships has allowed journalists to come on board, and there is a lot of investigation going on, but still I would like to emphasize that the black hole is still here. That's the first question. Another related question to this one is, wouldn't that be possible to start to have extensive service, multidisciplinary investigations in the countries of origin, including demography, sociology, statistics, anthropology, etc., to work on a sample of villages or cities and track how many people have gone missing. You gave the example of Ethiopia, but really we have never had that work, to my knowledge, and I'm sorry if there has been, but I'm not aware of it, to understand what happens in the Central Mediterranean, in other roads as well, not only the Central Mediterranean, but to understand what happens in the Mediterranean. We don't know, we don't ask the countries of origin, the communities, the villages, to have a real scientific approach with samples, with numbers, with statistics, and with a large-scale multidisciplinary approach. That's a first very painful question to me. The second one is about the missing people. Who are they? Who are the people in the Mediterranean mass grave? What were the determinants of their migration? We don't know. We sometimes have examples, but we are unable at the moment to give much information about identities, personal histories, names, circumstances of the deaths. Why did they leave their country? Why did they leave Libya? There was a study in 2016, I think, if I remember well, mentioning that only 60%, that more than 60% of the people who crossed and arrived in Italy originally didn't plan to leave to Europe, to leave Libya to Europe, and that was a surprise to me to learn that. But I've never read anything else on that since then. So I think there is a real lack of investigation on the reasons of why people are fleeing, and this is shocking compared to what happens on land when someone goes missing. And then more generally in the recent history, I would like to know what is the history of the sea, what is the history of the Mediterranean as a humanitarian space or as a space of denial of maritime and humanitarian law. We have spots, we have a few investigations, and it's really great that we have that already in a few years, what you have described, Mattia, for instance, the urban operations, but it's only pieces and bits and pieces, and it would be really, really important to me to have a wider scale investigation. What happens at sea when boats in distress encounter other ships? How many ships do they encounter before they are rescued or before they disappear? What happens if merchant marine ships try to rescue them? How often is there a denial of assistance from other ships? What is the proportion of rescue in the end compared to the boats who are leaving from the Libyan shores? And of course, it would be very, very useful to have a systematic analysis of the response given by maritime authorities to these distress signals that we know when we know about them, because we don't necessarily know about them now that the Central Mediterranean is supposed to be coordinated by a state, Libya, which is absolutely not in the capacity to do so. But so what do the competent maritime authorities do? Do they enforce? Do they ignore the signals, etc.? So we have given some, we can bring some elements to understand that from our own operations. We put that in our reports, but I think there's a lack of systematic analysis of the reactions by states. Not talking, of course, about Libya. Libya, what are and the European countries? Here it's a huge questions. There is a lack of transparency, obviously, about the mechanisms of financing Libya for their supposed coordination of search and rescue. And I think I've read yesterday that a journalist has to go to the court to ask for data. We don't know even what is the money, where does that come from, where does that goes to in Libya. So as long as we cannot describe these mechanisms, it is very complicated then to have the right pledges in advocacy. So that's, I think it's really a very important need there. And it would be very helpful to help show the vicious circle that is happening, because money is coming both from migrants who pay to flee from the detention camps in Libya, and money is coming from the EU states. So there is no reason so far that Libya should stop this very lucrative criminal activity. I would be very keen also on having more insight on the Libyan hell and the mechanisms of smuggling people, but this is also something very sensitive for us as rescue organizations, because as you know, we are accused of being in collusion with smugglers all the time. So this is something we cannot even try to understand and touch. So we need other researchers to understand these mechanisms and to describe that. And there is very little available information, data on that. Finally, I'm sorry, many ideas, finally, the last one. There is such a panel and a set of tools that has been developed to harass rescue organizations that I think it's really worth a very thorough investigation, comprehensive, to see what are the tools used by states to prevent us to rescue people and to get into these criminalization mechanisms and tactics that have been developed over the last years. So just to conclude, there are some opportunities. There is now, there are actors at sea, there are journalists, there are civil society actors there. So I think it's a great opportunity to go forward. There is an interest in university in research. It's great. But yeah, we see the challenges as well, the politicization of our action, the criminalization. As for us, as an NGO, we are always in emergency mode, in crisis mode, always every day trying to handle a new crisis. So it's difficult for us to concentrate on these topics of research. Yeah, altogether, I think it would be really great to continue this very interesting knowledge. So thank you very much for the time, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you so much, Sophie.